Charlotte Wilson sat quietly in the corner of the courthouse waiting room, her small hands clutched tightly in her lap. At just 8 years old, she looked even tinier against the massive wooden benches that surrounded her. The building felt cold and scary, with its high ceilings and echoing footsteps that seemed to bounce off every wall. She didn't understand why she had to be here, but she knew it had something to do with her mommy and daddy fighting all the time. The little girl wore her best dress, a simple blue one with tiny white flowers that her grandmother had bought her last Christmas. Her blonde hair was neatly braided, though a few strands had come loose during the long morning of waiting. She kept looking toward the big wooden doors where the adults in black robes disappeared, hoping someone would come out and tell her she could go home. Charlotte's eyes were red and puffy from crying earlier that morning. She had woken up in her grandmother's house again, which meant another night away from her own bedroom with its princess wallpaper and stuffed animals. Her grandmother had explained in gentle words that there would be important people talking today about where Charlotte would live. But the explanation only made the little girl more confused and frightened. The courthouse was filled with people in fancy suits carrying briefcases and thick folders. They all seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. Charlotte watched them hurry past, their shoes clicking against the marble floor like a rhythm she couldn't understand. Some of them glanced at her with sympathetic looks, but most were too busy to notice the small girl sitting alone. A security guard stood near the entrance, checking bags and making sure everyone went through the metal detector. His name tag read, Officer Martinez, and he had been working at the courthouse for over 15 years. He had seen countless families come through these doors, many of them dealing with situations just like Charlotte's. Children caught in the middle of adult problems, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt upside down. Officer Martinez noticed Charlotte immediately when she arrived with her grandmother that morning. Something about the way she held herself, so small and trying so hard to be brave, reminded him of his own daughter when she was scared. He had watched as Charlotte's grandmother spoke quietly with the lawyers, pointing toward the little girl several times during their conversation. The morning dragged on slowly for Charlotte. She had brought a small coloring book and some crayons, but her hands were shaking too much to color properly. The pictures she tried to make came out messy and crooked, which only made her feel worse. She closed the book and hugged it against her chest instead, finding some comfort in having something that belonged to her in this strange place. People kept coming and going through the courthouse doors. Charlotte watched a family leave together, holding hands and smiling, and she wondered if that would ever be her again. She remembered when her family used to go places together, to the park, to get ice cream, to visit relatives. Those days felt like they happened to someone else now, like stories from a book she had read long ago. Her stomach growled quietly, reminding her that she had barely touched her breakfast that morning. Her grandmother had packed some crackers in a juice box, but Charlotte didn't feel hungry even though she knew she should eat. Everything tasted wrong lately, and even her favorite foods seemed to have lost their flavor. The lawyers had explained to Charlotte's grandmother that today's hearing would help decide what was best for the little girl's future. Words like custody and visitation rights floated through adult conversations, but Charlotte only understood that important decisions were being made about her life by people she had never met before. Officer Martinez continued his duties throughout the morning, but he found his attention drawn back to Charlotte again and again. He had 3 children of his own, and the sight of her sitting there so patiently, trying so hard to be good in a situation no child should have to face, touched something deep in his heart. He had to follow strict rules about not getting involved in cases, but watching her small figure in that big waiting room made those rules feel heavy and cold. As the hours passed, Charlotte's composure began to crack. She had been trying so hard to be brave, just like her grandmother had asked her to be. But the waiting was becoming too much, and the scary sounds and unfamiliar faces were making her feel more and more alone. Her bottom lip started to tremble, and despite her best efforts, tears began to form in her eyes. She looked around the waiting room, hoping to see her grandmother coming back from wherever the adults had gone to talk, but there was no sign of anyone she knew, just more strangers with serious faces and important papers. The tears that had been threatening all morning finally spilled over, rolling down her cheeks in quiet streams. Charlotte tried to wipe her eyes with the sleeve of her dress, but the tears kept coming. She felt embarrassed crying in front of all these grown-ups, but she couldn't help it anymore. Everything felt too big, too scary, and too confusing for an 8-year-old to handle alone. The sound of her quiet sniffling echoed in the large waiting room, mixing with the clicking of heels and rustling of papers. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. In that moment, Charlotte felt more alone than she had ever felt in her entire young life. Officer Martinez noticed the change immediately. His trained eyes had been keeping track of everyone in the courthouse, but when he saw Charlotte's shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, his heart clenched. He stood at his post watching this brave little girl finally break down under the weight of circumstances, far beyond her control, and felt the strict rules of his job pressing against his natural instinct to help a child in distress. Officer Martinez watched Charlotte's quiet breakdown with growing concern. As a father himself, every instinct told him to go comfort the crying child. But courthouse regulations were clear about maintaining professional boundaries. Security personnel were not supposed to engage personally with people involved in legal proceedings. The rules existed for good reasons: to avoid complications, to maintain neutrality, and to prevent any appearance of impropriety that might affect cases. But watching Charlotte struggle alone was becoming unbearable. She sat there crying softly, trying to muffle her sobs so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Her small body shook with the effort of keeping her emotions contained, and Martinez could see she was fighting a losing battle against her fear and confusion. The other people in the waiting room began to notice Charlotte's distress. A few cast sympathetic glances in her direction, but everyone seemed unsure about what to do. This was a courthouse, after all, where people minded their own business and stayed focused on their own legal matters. Nobody wanted to overstep boundaries or get involved in someone else's family situation. Charlotte's tears fell faster now, and she buried her face in her hands. The coloring book slipped from her lap and fell to the floor with a soft thud, its pages scattered slightly. She didn't even notice, lost in her overwhelming sadness and the frightening uncertainty of not knowing what would happen to her life. Martinez found himself taking a small step away from his post, then stopping. His supervisor wasn't in the immediate area, but the security cameras would record any interaction he had with courthouse visitors. He had worked hard to build his reputation as a reliable, rule-following officer. His job provided good benefits for his family, and he couldn't afford to jeopardize his position by breaking protocol. Yet something about Charlotte's situation felt different from the usual courthouse drama he witnessed daily. This wasn't an adult who had made choices that led them here. This was an innocent child, caught in circumstances completely beyond her control. She hadn't asked for her parents to fight or for lawyers to decide her future. She was simply a little girl who needed comfort in a scary situation. The minutes ticked by slowly. Charlotte's grandmother still hadn't returned from the meeting with the attorneys, and there was no telling how much longer the discussions would continue. Legal proceedings often dragged on for hours, especially in custody cases where every detail needed careful consideration. Martinez thought about his own 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. What would he want someone to do if she were sitting alone and crying in a place like this? The answer came immediately and clearly. He would want someone to show her kindness, rules or no rules. The realization made his decision easier. He looked around the waiting room one more time, noting the positions of the security cameras and checking that his supervisor was still occupied elsewhere. Then he made a choice that went against his training, but aligned perfectly with his heart. He left his post and walked slowly toward Charlotte. As he approached, Charlotte looked up with tear-stained cheeks and frightened eyes. She didn't know what to expect from the uniformed officer walking toward her. In her limited experience, people in uniforms were authority figures who enforced rules and expected children to behave properly. She probably thought she was in trouble for crying. Martinez crouched down to Charlotte's eye level, making himself less intimidating. His voice was gentle and warm when he spoke, carrying none of the official tone he usually used in his security role. He introduced himself simply, without the formal language that might frighten a child already overwhelmed by legal proceedings. The kindness in his voice seemed to surprise Charlotte. She had expected to be scolded or told to quiet down, but instead this stranger was speaking to her like her grandfather used to, with patience and genuine care. Her crying slowed slightly as she tried to focus on what he was saying. Martinez asked Charlotte her name, and when she whispered her response, he repeated it back to her with a smile. Using someone's name was a simple way to establish connection and make them feel seen as an individual, rather than just another person in the courthouse crowd. For Charlotte, hearing her name spoken kindly felt like a small anchor in the storm of confusion surrounding her. He noticed her coloring book on the floor and gently picked it up, handing it back to her. The simple gesture showed Charlotte that he cared about the things that mattered to her, even something as small as a coloring book. She clutched it against her chest again, grateful to have it back. When Martinez asked if she was okay, Charlotte's fresh tears gave him all the answer he needed. She shook her head, unable to put into words all the fear and sadness she was feeling. How could an 8-year-old explain that her whole world felt like it was falling apart? That she didn't understand why her family couldn't be together anymore, or that she was terrified about where she would live. The security officer understood without needing detailed explanations. He had seen enough family court cases to recognize the signs of a child caught in a custody battle. The expensive lawyers, the formal procedures, the way Charlotte kept looking toward the courtroom doors. It all painted a clear picture of a little girl whose life was being decided by others. Martinez made another decision that went against protocol. Instead of returning to his post after checking on Charlotte, he remained crouched beside her bench. His presence seemed to calm her slightly, and for the first time that morning, she wasn't completely alone with her fears. Other courthouse staff members began to notice the security guard's unusual behavior. A few raised eyebrows and exchanged glances, but no one immediately intervened. Martinez had a reputation as a dedicated employee, and his colleagues recognized that something about this situation had moved him to act outside normal procedures. The moment stretched between them, a uniformed officer and a frightened child, connected by basic human compassion that transcended courthouse rules and professional boundaries. Charlotte's tears continued to fall, but they were quieter now, no longer the desperate sobs of complete isolation. Martinez noticed that Charlotte was trembling slightly, and he realized the courthouse's air conditioning was probably too cold for such a small person wearing just a thin dress. Without thinking about regulations, he shrugged off his uniform jacket and gently placed it around her shoulders. The jacket was far too big for her tiny frame, but it provided warmth and, more importantly, a sense of protection. Charlotte looked up at him with surprise. Adults had been making decisions about her and talking over her head all morning, but this man was actually doing something just for her comfort. She pulled the jacket tighter around herself, grateful for both the warmth and the gesture of kindness from someone who didn't even know her. The security officer sat down on the bench beside Charlotte, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she didn't feel alone. His presence transformed the cold, intimidating waiting room into something slightly more manageable. For the first time since arriving at the courthouse, Charlotte felt like someone actually cared about how she was feeling. Martinez began talking to Charlotte in a soft, conversational tone. He didn't ask her about the legal proceedings or why she was there. Those topics were clearly too overwhelming for her. Instead, he asked about simpler things. Did she like to color? What was her favorite color? Did she have any pets? These normal childhood questions helped ground Charlotte in familiar territory. Charlotte's responses came slowly at first, whispered answers between sniffles. But gradually, as Martinez continued to show genuine interest in her replies, she began to open up slightly. She told him about her cat, Whiskers, who liked to sleep on her bed. She mentioned that purple was her favorite color, and that she liked to draw pictures of flowers and butterflies. As they talked, Martinez learned that Charlotte was in 2nd grade and that her teacher's name was Mrs. Peterson. These small details painted a picture of a normal little girl living a normal childhood until everything changed. The contrast between her everyday world of school and pets and coloring books and the formal legal environment she was trapped in now made her situation even more poignant. Other people in the waiting room continued to watch this unusual interaction between the security guard and the child. Some seemed touched by the kindness being shown, while others appeared concerned about the break in protocol. But Martinez had made his choice, and he remained focused entirely on Charlotte, rather than worrying about observers. Charlotte surprised herself by actually smiling slightly when Martinez told her a gentle joke about a cat who wore a hat. It was the first time she had smiled in days, and the small expression of happiness seemed to lighten something heavy that had been pressing on her chest. For just a moment, she felt like a regular kid again instead of a problem that adults needed to solve. The security officer noticed the change in Charlotte's demeanor and felt encouraged. He continued sharing harmless, silly stories that made her smile, tales about dogs who could dance and birds who wore tiny shoes. Nothing too exciting or loud, just gentle humor appropriate for a scared child who needed distraction from her worries. As they sat together, Martinez became increasingly aware that he was violating multiple workplace policies. He had left his assigned post, engaged personally with someone involved in legal proceedings, and was now providing what could be seen as emotional support that might influence the child's state of mind during custody proceedings. Any one of these actions could result in disciplinary measures or even termination, but every time he considered returning to his post, he looked at Charlotte's face and saw how much calmer she had become with his presence. Her tears had stopped, her trembling had eased, and she was actually participating in conversation. How could he abandon her now, when his kindness was clearly making a difference in her frightening day? Charlotte, meanwhile, was experiencing something she hadn't felt in weeks, the simple comfort of having an adult pay attention to her needs. During all the legal meetings and family arguments, she had often felt invisible, like a possession being discussed rather than a person with feelings. But Officer Martinez was talking to her, not about her, and treating her like her thoughts and feelings mattered. The little girl began sharing more details about her life. She told Martinez about her best friend at school, Emma, and how they liked to play on the swings together. She mentioned that she missed her dog, who was staying with her daddy while she stayed with Grandma. These glimpses into her disrupted world helped Martinez understand just how much upheaval she was experiencing. When Charlotte mentioned missing her regular bedtime stories, Martinez made another spontaneous decision. He began telling her a simple, improvised story about a brave little girl who went on an adventure to find a magical garden. The story was gentle and hopeful, featuring a protagonist who overcame challenges through kindness and courage, qualities he could see in Charlotte herself. Charlotte listened intently to the story, her eyes wide with interest. For 20 minutes, she was transported away from courtrooms and custody battles into a world where problems had solutions, and brave little girls always found their way home. The story became a bridge between her fear and a sense of possibility that maybe things could work out okay. As Martinez spoke, he noticed courthouse staff members occasionally glancing in their direction, some with approval and others with concern. His supervisor would eventually notice his absence from the security checkpoint, and there would likely be questions about his behavior. But watching Charlotte's face as she listened to the story, seeing her shoulders relax and her breathing become steady, Martinez knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The story he told wasn't just entertainment for Charlotte. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning child, a reminder that even in scary situations, there were still good people who cared about her well-being. Through his simple act of storytelling, Martinez was giving Charlotte something precious, hope that adults could be trusted to put her needs first. As Martinez finished his story about the brave little girl and the magical garden, Charlotte clapped her small hands together softly. It was the first genuinely happy expression she had shown all day, and the sight of it made Martinez's heart feel full despite his growing concern about the professional consequences of his actions. Charlotte looked up at him with eyes that were still sad but no longer filled with the desperate fear that had consumed her earlier. She thanked him quietly for the story, her voice still soft but stronger than the whispered responses she had given when he first approached her. The simple interaction had created a small bubble of safety in the midst of her overwhelming circumstances. Martinez checked his watch and realized he had been away from his post for nearly an hour. In courthouse security terms, this was a serious breach of protocol that would definitely be noticed and reported. But looking at Charlotte's improved state, he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision. Sometimes being human mattered more than following rules. Just then, Charlotte's grandmother appeared in the doorway of the meeting room, looking around anxiously for her granddaughter. When she spotted Charlotte sitting calmly with the security officer, her expression showed a mixture of relief and confusion. She had left a crying, frightened child and returned to find the same child engaged in quiet conversation with a uniformed stranger. Charlotte waved to her grandmother, And for the first time that day, the wave wasn't desperate or pleading. It was simply a normal greeting from a child to a loved one. Her grandmother approached cautiously, unsure about the appropriateness of the security guard's interaction with Charlotte, but clearly grateful that the little girl seemed calmer. Martinez stood up respectfully as Charlotte's grandmother approached, immediately switching back to his professional demeanor, while still maintaining the warmth that had comforted Charlotte. He introduced himself properly and briefly explained that he had noticed Charlotte was upset and had stayed with her to make sure she was okay. Charlotte's grandmother, Mrs. Wilson, was a woman in her 60s who had been thrust into an impossible situation when her son and daughter-in-law's marriage fell apart. She was doing her best to provide stability for Charlotte, but the legal proceedings were exhausting and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Seeing her granddaughter calm and even slightly cheerful was an unexpected gift. Mrs. Wilson thanked Martinez with genuine emotion in her voice. She explained that Charlotte had been having nightmares and crying fits for weeks, and that getting her to eat or sleep had become daily struggles. The fact that a stranger had been able to comfort Charlotte when family members were struggling to reach her was both humbling and hopeful. Martinez carefully removed his jacket from Charlotte's shoulders, but she looked reluctant to give it up. The jacket had become a symbol of safety and kindness, and returning it felt like losing that protection. Understanding her hesitation, Martinez knelt down and told Charlotte that she had been very brave today, and that brave girls like her would always find people willing to help when they needed it most. Charlotte nodded solemnly at his words, processing this new idea that there might be other kind people in the world beyond her family. She had been so focused on the adults who were making difficult decisions about her life that she had forgotten there were also adults who simply wanted to help children feel better. Mrs. Wilson informed Martinez that the attorneys needed a few more minutes to finalize some paperwork and asked if it would be possible for Charlotte to remain in the waiting area a bit longer. Martinez assured her that Charlotte would be fine and that he would keep an eye on her from his post. The implication was clear. He was offering to continue watching over Charlotte even after returning to his official duties. As Mrs. Wilson headed back toward the meeting room, Charlotte reached out suddenly and grasped Martinez's hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his much larger ones, and she looked up at him with an expression that was both grateful and pleading. She didn't want him to leave, didn't want to lose the one person who had made this scary day bearable. The gesture was innocent and pure, a child reaching for comfort from someone who had shown her kindness. But Martinez knew that this simple human connection was exactly the kind of personal involvement that courthouse regulations were designed to prevent. Accepting Charlotte's gesture meant making himself even more vulnerable to disciplinary action. For a moment, Martinez hesitated. His training told him to gently remove his hand and return to his post immediately. His job security depended on maintaining professional boundaries, and he had already pushed those boundaries far beyond acceptable limits. His family depended on his income, and he couldn't afford to lose his position over one emotional decision. But Charlotte's small hand felt so trusting in his, and her eyes held such hope that he wouldn't abandon her like everyone else seemed to be doing. In that instant, Martinez realized that some moments in life transcended professional considerations. Sometimes being a good human being mattered more than being a good employee. Instead of pulling away, Martinez gently squeezed Charlotte's hand in return. He told her quietly that she was going to be okay, that the grown-ups were working hard to make the best decisions for her, and that she was stronger and braver than she knew. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine care from someone who had chosen to see her as a person rather than just another courthouse visitor. Charlotte smiled at him again, this time with more confidence. The connection between them had become something special, a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, unexpected kindness could appear when it was needed most. She finally released his hand, but the comfort of knowing he cared remained with her. Martinez knew he needed to return to his post before his absence created more problems, but he also knew that something important had happened during his time with Charlotte. By choosing compassion over compliance, he had helped a frightened child find a moment of peace in a chaotic situation. Whatever consequences awaited him professionally, he had acted according to his deepest values as a human being. Martinez reluctantly returned to his security post, but he positioned himself so he could still see Charlotte in the waiting area. She had settled back onto the bench with her coloring book, and while she wasn't actively coloring, she no longer looked panicked or desperately alone. The transformation in her demeanor was remarkable, from a child in crisis to a child who was coping with a difficult situation. Within minutes of Martinez returning to his position, his supervisor, Captain Roberts, approached with a concerned expression. Roberts had been reviewing security footage and had noticed Martinez's extended absence from his assigned post. As someone responsible for courthouse security protocols, he couldn't ignore such a clear violation of established procedures. Captain Roberts asked Martinez to explain his actions, and Martinez knew that honesty was his only option. He described noticing Charlotte's distress, his decision to check on her welfare, and his subsequent choice to remain with her until she calmed down. He accepted full responsibility for abandoning his post and acknowledged that his actions violated multiple security protocols. Captain Roberts listened carefully to Martinez's explanation, his expression remaining neutral and professional. As a supervisor, he had to consider the security implications of guards leaving their posts, the liability issues of personnel engaging personally with courthouse visitors, and the potential impact on legal proceedings when security staff became involved with parties to cases. However, Roberts was also a father and a human being who understood the impulse to help a frightened child. He had observed the interaction between Martinez and Charlotte on the security monitors, and while he couldn't officially approve of the protocol violations, he privately admired Martinez's compassion. The situation presented a challenging balance between enforcement of rules and recognition of extraordinary circumstances. Roberts informed Martinez that there would need to be an official incident report documenting the violation of security procedures. This report would become part of Martinez's personnel file and could potentially affect his employment status, depending on how seriously the courthouse administration viewed the breach of protocol. The conversation was professional but not hostile, suggesting that Roberts was trying to handle the situation as fairly as possible. Martinez accepted the consequences without complaint or excuse. He understood the importance of security protocols and didn't expect special treatment because his motives were compassionate. He simply stated that he had seen a child in distress and felt compelled to help, and that he would accept whatever disciplinary action was deemed appropriate. As they spoke, both men could see Charlotte in the waiting area, now sitting calmly and occasionally glancing toward Martinez's security station. Her improved condition was visible evidence of the positive impact his intervention had made. Even though that impact didn't change the fact that rules had been broken, Captain Roberts concluded their discussion by telling Martinez to complete his shift normally while he prepared the incident report. The tone suggested that while consequences were inevitable, they might not be as severe as they could have been. Roberts seemed to understand that Martinez's actions, while unauthorized, had been motivated by genuine concern for a child's welfare rather than negligence or misconduct. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued waiting for her grandmother to finish the legal meetings, but now she waited differently, not with the desperate anxiety that had consumed her earlier, but with the patient calm of someone who had learned that unexpected help could appear even in frightening situations. She felt stronger, more capable of handling whatever decisions the adults might make. Other courthouse visitors had witnessed the interaction between Martinez and Charlotte, and several had been moved by the display of kindness they observed. A few approached Martinez during the remainder of his shift to quietly commend his actions, expressing that they hoped someone would show similar compassion to their own children if they were ever in comparable circumstances. The legal proceedings finally concluded in the late afternoon. Charlotte's grandmother emerged from the meeting room looking exhausted, but relieved that the day's sessions were finished. The decisions about Charlotte's custody arrangement had been postponed, pending additional evaluations, which meant more uncertainty but also more time for everyone to consider what would truly be best for the little girl. When Mrs. Wilson came to collect Charlotte, the little girl immediately looked toward Martinez's security station. She waved goodbye to him with a smile that was genuinely happy rather than forced or polite. Martinez waved back, feeling a sense of completion about their interaction despite the professional complications it had created for him. As Charlotte and her grandmother prepared to leave the courthouse, Charlotte asked if she could thank Officer Martinez properly. Mrs. Wilson, understanding the significance of his kindness to her granddaughter, agreed to let Charlotte approach his station one final time before they departed. Charlotte walked up to Martinez with more confidence than she had shown all day. She looked up at him seriously and said simply, "Thank you for being nice to me when I was scared." Her words were direct and honest, carrying the weight of genuine gratitude from someone who had truly needed help and received it from an unexpected source. Martinez knelt down to Charlotte's level one more time and told her that she had been very brave, and that he knew she would continue to be brave no matter what happened next. He reminded her that there were good people everywhere who cared about children like her, and that she should never hesitate to ask for help when she needed it. Charlotte nodded seriously at his advice, processing this new understanding about the world. She had learned that even in scary places filled with rules and formal procedures, there were still individuals who would choose kindness over convenience, who would risk their own positions to comfort a frightened child. The little girl surprised Martinez by giving him a quick, gentle hug before returning to her grandmother's side. It was a spontaneous gesture of affection and gratitude that sealed the bond they had formed during one of the most difficult days of Charlotte's young life. For Martinez, that hug represented everything meaningful about his decision to break protocol, the knowledge that sometimes being human mattered more than following rules. The days following the courthouse incident brought unexpected developments for both Charlotte and Officer Martinez. Charlotte returned to her grandmother's house with a noticeably different attitude about the legal proceedings that would determine her future. While she was still sad about her family situation, she no longer seemed paralyzed by fear about facing unknown adults who would make decisions about her life. Charlotte told her grandmother about Officer Martinez's kindness in detail, describing not just what he had done but how he had made her feel safe when everything else felt scary. Mrs. Wilson listened with growing amazement as Charlotte recounted their conversation, the stories he had told, and the way he had treated her like her feelings mattered. It was the most animated Charlotte had been in weeks. At the courthouse, Martinez faced the administrative review of his actions with a mixture of anxiety and peace. He knew he had violated important protocols, but he also knew he had acted according to his deepest values when faced with a child in distress. Whatever consequences awaited him, he could live with his decision to prioritize Charlotte's welfare over workplace rules. The incident report made its way through courthouse administration, generating mixed reactions among officials. Some viewed Martinez's actions as a serious breach of security protocol that could set a dangerous precedent if not addressed firmly. Others recognized that his intervention had been motivated by genuine concern for a child's welfare and had resulted in a positive outcome, without compromising courthouse security or legal proceedings. Captain Roberts found himself in the difficult position of recommending appropriate disciplinary action. He had to balance the need to maintain security standards with recognition that Martinez's actions, while unauthorized, had been both compassionate and effective. The situation highlighted the sometimes conflicting demands between rigid protocol adherence and human responsiveness to individual needs. News of the incident spread through courthouse staff, creating informal discussions about the appropriate balance between professional boundaries and human compassion. Many employees expressed private support for Martinez's actions, sharing their own observations of children struggling with family legal proceedings and their wishes that someone could do more to help. Charlotte's story also circulated among courthouse personnel who had witnessed the interaction. Several staff members who worked regularly with family court cases were moved by the account of Martinez's kindness and its impact on a frightened child. Some began advocating for policy changes that would allow for more appropriate support for children caught in legal proceedings. A week after the incident, Charlotte had to return to the courthouse for additional meetings with child welfare evaluators. Mrs. Wilson was concerned about how Charlotte would handle another day in the intimidating environment, but she was surprised to find that Charlotte seemed much less anxious about the prospect of returning. When they arrived at the courthouse, Charlotte immediately looked for Officer Martinez at the security checkpoint. She was disappointed to discover that a different guard was on duty that day, but she wasn't devastated by his absence. The confidence he had helped her develop remained with her, even when he wasn't physically present to provide reassurance. The child welfare evaluator was impressed by Charlotte's composure during their meeting. Unlike previous sessions where Charlotte had been withdrawn and tearful, She was now able to articulate her feelings about her family situation with remarkable clarity for an 8-year-old. She expressed hope that her parents could work out their problems while also acknowledging that she felt safe staying with her grandmother for now. Charlotte surprised the evaluator by mentioning Officer Martinez and describing how his kindness had helped her understand that there were good adults who cared about children's well-being. This comment led to questions about the interaction, and Charlotte's positive description of Martinez's behavior became part of her evaluation record. Meanwhile, Martinez continued his regular duties while awaiting the final decision about disciplinary action. He maintained his professional demeanor and followed all protocols strictly, but colleagues noticed a subtle change in how he interacted with courthouse visitors, particularly those who appeared distressed or confused. He seemed more attuned to people's emotional states while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. The administrative review concluded with a formal reprimand that was placed in Martinez's personnel file, along with a requirement that he attend additional training on security protocols and professional boundaries. However, the disciplinary action also included a notation recognizing the positive outcome of his intervention and his otherwise exemplary service record. Captain Roberts privately informed Martinez that while his actions had violated protocols, the administration acknowledged that his intervention had prevented a potential emergency situation with a distressed child. The relatively light disciplinary action reflected this recognition, though Roberts emphasized that future situations would need to be handled through proper channels. Martinez accepted the reprimand with grace, understanding that some accountability was necessary to maintain security standards. He also appreciated that the administration had considered the context and outcome of his actions, rather than focusing solely on the rule violations. The experience taught him about the complex balance between following procedures and responding to human needs. The courthouse administration, prompted partly by Charlotte's case and Martinez's intervention, began developing new protocols for handling situations involving distressed children during legal proceedings. These guidelines would provide security, staff and other personnel with appropriate ways to ensure child welfare while maintaining professional boundaries and security standards. Charlotte's evaluation sessions continued over several weeks, and her consistent emotional stability impressed all the professionals involved in her case. The transformation from the terrified child who had broken down in the courthouse waiting room to the resilient young girl who could express her needs and feelings clearly was remarkable to everyone who observed it. The positive change in Charlotte's demeanor influenced the recommendations made to the family court judge. Evaluators noted her emotional resilience and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances, factors that would be important in determining the best custody arrangement for her future well-being. 3 months later, Charlotte's custody case reached its final resolution. The judge, after reviewing extensive evaluations and recommendations, awarded joint custody to both parents, with Charlotte's primary residence remaining with her grandmother until her parents completed counseling and established more stable living situations. The arrangement prioritized Charlotte's emotional well-being while providing a path for family reunification. Charlotte had grown noticeably more confident throughout the legal process, showing remarkable resilience for someone so young. The child welfare evaluators attributed much of her emotional stability to the strong support system provided by her grandmother and to a pivotal moment early in the proceedings when she had learned that even strangers could be trusted to show kindness during difficult times. Officer Martinez continued his work at the courthouse, now with additional training in crisis intervention and child welfare protocols. The new guidelines developed after Charlotte's case allowed security personnel to provide appropriate assistance to distressed visitors while maintaining professional boundaries. Martinez became an informal mentor to other guards, sharing his experience about balancing security requirements with human compassion. The story of Martinez's kindness to Charlotte had spread beyond courthouse staff, reaching the local community through various informal networks. Parents facing family legal issues began specifically requesting information about courthouse support services, knowing that personnel were trained to recognize and respond appropriately to children's distress. Charlotte visited the courthouse one final time for the custody hearing that would formalize her living arrangement. She walked through the metal detector with confidence, no longer intimidated by the formal environment that had once terrified her. When she saw Martinez at his security post, she waved enthusiastically, and he smiled warmly in return. During a brief break in the proceedings, Charlotte's grandmother approached Martinez to thank him personally for his intervention months earlier. She explained that Charlotte's transformation from that frightening day had been remarkable, and that the little girl often spoke about the kind security guard who had helped her when she needed it. Most Mrs. Wilson shared that Charlotte had been attending counseling sessions to help her process the family changes, and that her therapist had been impressed by Charlotte's emotional vocabulary and her ability to identify trusted adults. Charlotte frequently mentioned Martinez as an example of how good people could be found in unexpected places, even during scary times. Martinez was deeply moved to learn about Charlotte's continued progress and the lasting impact of their brief interaction. He realized that his moment of choosing compassion over protocol had created ripple effects extending far beyond that single day in the courthouse waiting room. Sometimes small acts of kindness could change the trajectory of someone's entire experience. The judge's final custody decision reflected careful consideration of Charlotte's best interests, and Charlotte herself was invited to share her feelings about the arrangement in an age-appropriate way. She expressed satisfaction with continuing to live with her grandmother while maintaining relationships with both parents, showing a maturity that impressed all the adults involved in her case. After the hearing concluded successfully, Charlotte asked her grandmother if she could speak with Officer Martinez one more time before they left the courthouse. Mrs. Wilson agreed, understanding the significance of this relationship in Charlotte's healing process. Charlotte approached Martinez with a handmade card she had created in art therapy class. The card featured a drawing of a little girl and a security guard standing together under a rainbow, with "Thank you" written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Inside, she had written a simple message. "You helped me when I was scared. Now I know there are good people everywhere." Martinez accepted the card with genuine emotion, touched by Charlotte's thoughtfulness and artistic expression of gratitude. He told Charlotte how proud he was of her bravery throughout the difficult process and reminded her that she had taught him something important about the difference one person could make in another person's life. Charlotte's final words to Martinez were confident and forward-looking. "I'm not scared anymore because I know good people will help kids who need it." This statement represented her transformation from a terrified child overwhelmed by circumstances, beyond her control, to a young person who understood that the world contained both challenges and support. The courthouse implemented the new child welfare protocols, developed in response to Charlotte's case, training all personnel to recognize signs of child distress and providing appropriate intervention strategies. Martinez was selected to help train new employees, sharing his experience about the importance of seeing each courthouse visitor as an individual with unique needs. Charlotte's story became an informal case study used in courthouse training programs, illustrating how a single act of kindness could transform a child's experience of the legal system. The training emphasized that while professional boundaries were important, finding appropriate ways to show compassion could make the difference between trauma and healing. Years later, Charlotte would remember Officer Martinez as the person who taught her that kindness existed even in scary places. His willingness to risk his professional standing to comfort a frightened child had given her a foundation of trust in human goodness that would serve her throughout her life. Martinez often reflected on that day when a little girl's tears had moved him to abandon his post and break protocol. The formal reprimand remained in his personnel file, but the knowledge that he had helped Charlotte find courage during her darkest moment was worth any professional consequences. Sometimes the most important rules were the ones written in the heart, rather than in employee handbooks. The courthouse waiting room where Charlotte had once sat crying alone was now equipped with child-friendly books and activities, part of the policy changes inspired by her experience. Other children facing family legal proceedings would benefit from both these tangible improvements and the increased awareness among staff about the emotional needs of young courthouse visitors. Charlotte's hand reaching out to Officer Martinez that day had indeed caused rules to be abandoned immediately, not the courthouse security protocols, but the unwritten rules that often kept people from showing compassion when it was needed most. Their brief connection had proven that human kindness could flourish even within institutional constraints, creating hope and healing when both were desperately needed.